So my name's Natalie Hill. I'm head of Retinue Bank. My background is 10 years within the NHS and NHS England, managing banks, setting up banks, running banks, agency provision, temporary workforce, you name it, anything to do with workforce. I've managed that within the NHS. So I joined Retinue back in May this year to help them shape what a collaborative bank and the bank products should look like to support the NHS for the future. So obviously we've just had the NHS long-term workforce plan published back end of June, and there's lots in there that I know you're all working on to support your strategy for temporary workforce provision at trust level and ICB level in the future. Can we have the next slide, please? Lovely. So the agenda today, we're going to have, as I say, we've got an expert panel of people to obviously walk you through their experiences of looking at the temporary workforce provision, looking at digital passporting and enabling staff movement. And we have bank procurement that will be discussed as well. I will let those people introduce themselves at the start of their presentation. I won't steal their thunder. But as I say, it's super important at the moment within the NHS. We know that we get those gaps filled and we get them filled in the right way. And obviously as well, it's about having the right technology to support that and the right solutions in place and the strategy to move it forward, probably at pace as well. It is quite high demand now from the ICB level in terms of getting things implemented quite quickly to reduce that cost, increase the compliance of workers coming through and the compliance of bank workers, and look at that continuity of supply and retention, which is obviously high on the agenda, which we'll talk about throughout the presentation. So as I say, we've got the lovely Catherine Wilkins looking at workforce planning and a temporary workforce. So understanding what those basics are, what are we doing around rostering and identifying those gaps. And then Marcus is going to join us to talk about movement across an ICS and how the digital passporting and enabling staff movement programme is planning for that and planning the phases of that and what needs to be considered. And then Helen will talk to us about bank procurement and everything around frameworks and how you can procure the right solutions from suppliers in the right way and the safest way for you in the NHS with minimal risk. I'm then happy to talk about some bank solutions and my experience of implementing some solutions within the NHS, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions and answers. You will be muted throughout the presentation, but please feel free to use the chat facility. We will return to the chat facility to have a look at what questions have been asked. But if you've got a burning desire to ask a question throughout as well, because we've only got limited people on the call, just pop your hand up, raise your hand, and we'll address that as well. That's not a problem at all. Hopefully more people will join. As I say, we have had a lot of acceptances, so without further ado, I think we will get going. So I will hand over to Catherine. Go next slide, please, Terence. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie, and hi everyone, or hi Hannah. I'm Catherine Wilkins. I work for NHS England currently in the clinical workforce productivity team. I'm a nurse and a midwife by background, so clinically focused, but I've been working in the workforce space for a number of years now. So I'm delighted to be able to join you today. And you might think this is slightly odd because I'm not specifically going to be talking about collaborative banks or things, but more the process and the things that underpin workforce planning in the NHS, which then one of the solutions to enable the deployment, effective deployment of staff is, of course, collaborative banks. So it's the underpinning bit that I'm going to cover. Next slide, please, Terence. So just as Natalie just alluded to there, the long-term workforce plan has come out in the last few months, which is really helpful. But this sits on a backdrop of many national drivers and documents that have been over the last few years. So starting back in 2016 with the National Quality Board Guidance on Safe Staffing, which actually replaced the 2013 guidance this has been around for some time, going through developing workforce safeguards, the NHS long-term plan, the NHS people plan, and obviously the e-rostering of the clinical workforce as well. And these documents all are underpinning with the guidance, the must-dos, the clear values that need to be set in order to have the right staff with the right skills in the right place at the right time. Next slide, please. So just picking through some of these, the key principles of workforce planning, and getting this right is absolutely critical. We can't even begin to think about how we run the clubs of banks or how we do temporary staffing unless we know how many staff that we actually need in order to run our services safely and effectively. So the documents that I've outlined there really set out clearly what needs to be done to ensure we do have the right staff, right skills, right place, right time. And essentially there's a triangle for safe staffing, and I'm aware that safe staffing is a phrase that's used within nursing particularly, but actually it does encompass all professions, because that's what we're about, is ensuring that we have the right staff for the patients that we have that we're looking after. So we're looking at using the evidence-based tools where they exist, and there's not many of them around, but where they do exist, we use them. Professional judgment, often maligned or undervalued, but actually evidence shows that professional judgment is a really critical part of workforce planning. And then also triangulating that with outcomes, particularly patient outcomes, but also staff outcomes and the workforce outcomes as well, things like retention, sickness management, etc. is key. And just one of my little hobby horses is the fact that any proposed service changes should have a quality impact assessment, which should be ratified by trust boards. And this is often because we talk about doing things differently, but forget to really look at things and make sure that we've considered all the aspects of the change and who it might affect before implementing it across the board. Next slide, please. Some other considerations around workforce planning really are looking at your activity levels. So let's think about demand and capacity evaluation. How many patients have you got coming through, whether it's a clinic, whether it's theatres, whether it's wards, or the whole service. And then how many staff do you have, and then how many do you need in order to deliver that demand. Picking up things like seasonal variation, we don't have it the same sense in the NHS as we used to really do the summer effects, which meant you could close some wards and everything was sort of quite down a little bit. That just isn't happening anymore. It feels like winter constantly round the clock now, but there will be some changes. Some pediatrics, for example, there will also have a big rise in respiratory illnesses. When all the kids go back to school after the summer holidays, etc., it's maybe slightly different in adult services, because it's just considering your own service and what the needs are. Developments in services, so changes to the way things are run, so things like advances in like robotic surgery and things like that may change your pathways to maybe delivering more services on a day-to-day basis rather than requiring overnight stays in hospital, etc. It's really understanding what the technology and the science is saying around that as well, and putting that into the equation. What your contracts do, commissioning is obviously key. Service changes as well, if that can come under contracting. Sometimes services will move from one trust to another. And that, again, just needs to be factored into the equation. How many staff and you get, and also staff with a relevant experience. So often we will say that you can get lots of staff that don't necessarily have the right experience. How long does it take to train staff in your area, in your specialty? Is it a few weeks? Is it a few months? Is it a couple of years? So thinking and considering those aspects when you're looking at your planning for the workforce. And for staffing, so particularly looking at things that may require to be above the planned establishment. So you're thinking about maybe waiting initiatives, or perhaps in nursing context, there's things like enhanced care and care assessments that have additional care needs and needs and more than maybe have been planned for in the first place. The patient and the staff outcome measures, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to understand the impact of whatever we do and to look at that across the board. Specialty specific guidance, so there are lots of specialties now have their own guidance, so stroke, medicine, A&E, ITU, they've all got their own guidance around the staff and the workforce that you might need to use. Another thing that's often forgotten about is population health, socioeconomic factors. Is there a massive amount of new builds, new houses going into your area that's going to bring a certain demographic of people? Are you putting a huge new elderly and care retirement village in? Are you putting in housing where you're going to have lots of families and young homes of young couples who are being children, and having that wider view as well. And also considering potential of using new ways, so you can't just manufacture lots of more nurses or lots more doctors. Actually, what are the different ways that could be used to run your service or to support your service running in the midst, and as I said earlier, the use of policy impact assessments and things like that as well. Next slide, please. Hi, I see a hand up. I can't see who it is.
It's Andrew. Did you want to come in, Andrew?
Yeah, quick question from myself on the subject of determining what the establishment, the actual staffing establishment should be within a particular service or trust. And I wondered whether that was calculated based on a sort of standard best practice methodology, or whether there's sort of vast differences across the NHS and across the services within each of the trusts, whether, you know, how much scope there is for efficiency within that might actually be impacting agency demand and therefore the balance between bank and agency and the management of those supply chains and all of that, which could potentially get messy.
Okay, sure. So as we said at one of the earlier slides, using evidence-based tools is the gold standard really in terms of it. So within nursing, we have things like taking and care tools, which can be used in adults, children, young people, community and ED and mental health services as well. They're quite well established now and are used, and within maternity services they use what we call birth rate plus as well. Within medical and AHP areas, professions, they don't have tools as such, so they will tend to use demand data to look at what's been used over the last year or 2 years and the workforce that they've got. So there's some sort of calculations within that you can use, but there's lots of conversations going on around this at the moment, because within nursing, for instance, we have these things where we offer headroom, which is planning for leave, for study leave, for annual leave, etc. It's not always calculated in other professions, and certainly not in the same way. So it's making sure that there's equity, but also you are planning for, just because a consultant's gone off on holidays for 2 weeks doesn't mean that everything should suddenly stop in that service. So how do you ensure that there's appropriate cover across the board? So definitely lots of conversations going on in that space. The guidance is generally within the Developing Workforce Safeguards document, but it's all open to interpretation, I think.
It does. It's interesting for me when I'm working with trust to design sustainable models for agency management and reducing the dependency on that in favor of banks and collaborative banks. And often I wonder whether there's variations in, I guess, how much each of the trusts or or services are effectively shooting themselves in the foot sometimes with demand that perhaps doesn't need to actually exist. That's helpful. Just while I'm on as well, can I just ask if you can get slightly closer to the mic as well, because it was muffling just very slightly there. I know you're out and about today as well, so it's difficult, but we're catching you. It's just ever so slightly muffled, that's all.
No problem. I'd hear people were coming too close too soon. Yes, no, absolutely. And I think there's just that thing as well around, if you know that what you should have. So, as a general guidance, we know that the way healthcare works, you're never going to have, it's not an exact science, you're not going to have exactly the right numbers all the time in a plan that's been set 6 months ago. But if you've got a baseline and you've got good processes in place that enable that to be reviewed regularly, so if you suddenly saw an uptick in demand, an uptick in acuity of patients, for example, so I'm just thinking about things like moving virtual wards, that's an area that's, really massive on the agenda, how you move the sort of slightly less sick patients out of hospital into the community, and you care for them out there. So you've got a workforce that needs to sit out there. The patients that are then left in the hospital by nature are sicker. They're not people that can go out. Therefore, it's not just saying, well, that's fine, you can leave the same number of staff looking after them, because actually, because they're sicker, they actually need more care. So,
so you've got to be dynamic. It can't be exactly. You can be too rigid with it. Yeah,
exactly. So it is that whole thing around, having the processes and the governance, good quality governance in place, but having that eye on what's changing around about it, so which is really key, really critical. So just thinking about, once you set your workforce, this is what we know we need to have, then it's about deploying them effectively across the board. And the three main ways around this are rostering, job planning, and then scheduling. And scheduling is more commonly used in community services, but it's also obviously used in theatres, and you're trying to map your clinical staff with the demand of patients coming through. Next slide, please.
You need the next slide, Catherine?
I can't see the next slide. Is it up already?
There we go.
There we go. So as part of the long-term plan, this was set out in 2019, there were meaningful use standards developed, and also the levels of attainment for EVOS training and job planning. It really says how you maximise the use of your software and the use of EVOS training and job planning. So how do you ensure that you are demonstrating all the benefits and getting all the benefits you can out of food? These are available, and I'll put the link in the chat and finish speaking on the future website. But essentially, these are all out for each level. And generally, people will move through from level 0 to no software in place at all, through to level 4, where the thing you've got governance and all processes are in place. You've got good sites and shared tool sites and across the board. The next slide, please. I'm just going to skip over this slide quite quickly because Natalie specifically asked me to look at rostering rather than job planning, but you'll be able to get the slides afterwards. Just looking at why you would implement job planning. Yes, I'll skip over it, but it's there for you to look at. And a lot of the benefits and the implementation principles are similar for both, but job planning generally is done more in the consultant workforce and the non-work-based workforce as well, but you can use and should use job planning and rostering together as well as separately. If we can move on to the next slide. In terms of implementing rostering, and I think I'm not going to go into each line of these in detail, but just to say that there are advantages and benefits for individuals, for all the individual members of your workforce, as well as for the organisation as a whole. It's definitely something in sight and to transparency and fairness, where you use electronic rostering, especially if you use your system to its maximum effect. And also for the organisation, you've got good quality data to make decisions, as well as supporting rapid redeployment, third channel. We've become through COVID-19, which was quite a challenging time. And one of the big challenges was not being able to see where your workforce was to move them around. So actually having staff on an electronic register enables the organisation to see who they've got, what skills they've got, and then who is most appropriate to be moved around the services. And it also supports other things like waiting initiatives, looking at obviously what we're talking about today, reducing agency, particularly that maximising the use of your temporary staff and bank staff and tools, rather than having to use more expensive opportunities as well. Next slide, please. So some of these we've covered already, but it's really looking at what are the benefits and also what are the drivers. So as I said, and I do repeat this quite often, but it's just such a crucial point, is we're aiming to have the right staff with the right skills in the right place at the right time to deliver the best quality care to our patients. That's what we're about. And it's ensuring that if you've got good e-rostering practices and governance in place within your organisation, that can then be translated up into ICB. So when we're talking later about collaborative science, if you've got that, the data and the good line of sight because it works both in your ICB, then you can make decisions at an ICB level and ensure that you can move staff around more effectively and efficiently across the board. And as I mentioned before, just the learning from COVID, there's a lot of concerns and issues around the lack of visibility of staff. Rotors kept on Excel documents and drives hidden on hospital systems. So actually having them on a good software platform, being able to see that enables that alignment of patient needs and rapid redeployment as appropriate. And it also ensures that you can see better visibility of any buffers of resources in the system as well. Next slide, please. Technology is obviously a key part of this. The clue is in the title, e-rostering and e-job planning. So really looking at how we use that. And I think a lot of organisations have got now got platforms, software solutions in place, but often they're not utilising them to their maximum. And there's often myths out there that the system won't do this, won't do that. So the systems generally are very good, and they do what you need them to do. It's just about working out what that looks like, and ensuring that you've explored those possibilities within them and to see that. And again, the benefits and advantages for individuals, team leaders, and individuals, and the organisation across the board. So next slide, please. One of the key areas that often people forget about is culture and practice. And there's lots of things that go on that are hidden, especially when you're working on Excel sheets and hidden in the deep dark depths of the trust drive. Things go on that we know about and everybody talks about but doesn't talk about. And this is about ensuring that there is openness, transparency and fairness across the board. Actually working with a huge issue at the moment. Lots of people talking about it, lots of people trying to put solutions in place to support it. And a lot of it comes down to that transparency, fairness, that everybody gets a good bite of the cherry rather than one or two that get the same across the board. And a lot of the behaviours and things that happen have gone on for many years. And actually the use of rostering and e-rostering as a tool may almost bring that to the surface and enable effective management of poor behaviours that need to be stamped out, but then support that improved openness, transparency and fairness across the board. It uses metrics, data to evidence what's been going on, which is really helpful for everybody and cultivate a positive, healthy culture across the board. Next slide. So from a department level, it's really important that that you understand what this means. And so, as I said earlier, you set your establishment, you know what you've got, then it's about how you deploy them most effectively. So you can look at whether you met your plan, so were you above your establishment, below your establishment, how did you use annual leave, etc. How well in advance are you able to get your rosters out to us? The recommendation is actually 12 weeks, but we recommend also that people look at a minimum of 6 weeks. And I think 6 to 8 weeks seems to be where people find this most helpful for everybody, without having to make too many changes further down the line. Ensuring that you've got that transparent visibility of flexible working patterns, and also supporting flexible working opportunities, things like team-based registering or any hours and other solutions that are in place for us. Next slide, please. One of the key things that is often underestimated is the value of this thing and what this potential. And if you've got fairness, flexibility, good quality, the working in place with good governance, that will support your the potential of your staff in your unit, as well as also controlling the use of bank and agency, and particularly agency across the board, and understanding what drives that, whether it's an internal bank or whether it's a collaborative bank that's used across the system. It just makes it really clear about who's working and they're working, and again engenders that sense of team spirit and working together across the board. Next slide, please. Any questions? I'm just checking the time there. I think you're coming back to Q&A, aren't you, Natalie?
I am, but we've, like I say, we've got a limited sort of attendee list today, so it'd be quite nice and quite interactive throughout. If you're happy to take questions now, Catherine, we can do that. Asha, you've got your hand raised. Did you have one that somebody sent in?
Yeah, one of the attendees wasn't able, so it has came through. So they are having challenges at their trust in understanding if their agency spend is valid. So they need to ensure they identify the correct gaps in their workforce. How can they work with their rostering team to tackle this?
Okay, so it's about having the conversation, so ensuring once your establishment setting process has happened, or business planning, more commonly used as well, is to make sure that all that information goes onto the roster. So the roster stays as a live document and is viewed and updated regularly. The other thing is for if you're using KPIs that you recommend, and that they're being monitored regularly, that you understand where you're maybe going over or under. So using additional temporary staff or not being able to recruit temporary staff potentially, and then putting solutions in place to support that, and feeding that into your governance processes. But I think the key thing is the communication with your rostering team, and having them sort of as part of your wider, as a wider stakeholder in your conversation. If you're a ward or a clinical lead, that you know who your rostering team person is, and that you have conversations with them regularly. You keep them in the loop with what's going on, and use them to help support each other with taking things forward.
Fantastic, thanks, Catherine. Andrew?
It's not a question or an answer. It's just a follow-up to that point, really. Is I know one of the challenges the ICBs are working through is how do you, when 4 or 5 trusts with the same requirements and the same gaps in their roster, how do they prioritize that shared resource? And it's been a challenge for a few years, actually, of working out how you create a collaborative bank that benefits all of the trusts within it equally, without leaving somebody. And again, that's a debate. That's probably an entire webinar for another time. And I know quite a few people that would definitely be quite noisy in that debate. So we'll leave that. But yeah, I just wanted to bounce that to Asha. That's probably not a clear,
that's a
clear
good
answer
point
on that.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Catherine while we've got her on the call, for anyone on the call currently? I know I'm conscious some of you joined partway through, so we do have a Q&A afterwards. So unless anyone wants to come in now, I will swiftly move us on to our next presenter, who is Marcus. Marcus, I will let you introduce yourself in full, but thank you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing about enabling staff movement, particularly, obviously, as the title of the event is about our bank. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. And hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Appleton, and I work for NHS England, currently in the same team as Catherine. So I am the head of the clinical workforce productivity team and the enabling staff movements team and the NHS staff app team. So I seem to be collecting them at the moment. But today I'm here to talk to you about a lot of the work that sits really nicely with what Catherine has just been talking about. And that is essentially trying to make sure that you've got the right clinicians with the right skills, with the right patients at the right time. There are lots of things that have to come together to make that happen. Having really good e-rostering and job planning is one of them, and collaborative banks is definitely a big part of the picture. And what I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about is enabling staff movements, and the digital staff passport is another element of that, which is an enabler to be able to help staff move around the system more quickly, more easily, reduce the amount of time they have to do things like onboarding and mandatory training, and reduce repetition, which should free them up to spend more time with patients, and also reduce the amount of checks that organisations have to do, and things like that, because a lot of those checks would have been done for them. So if we could skip on to my first slide, that would be great.
We've got some technical issues, Terence.
Is it not showing? It's showing on mine.
No, I'll see if I can try and do that.
So I'll carry on. So essentially, the aim of the program, as I mentioned, is to allow staff to spend as much time with the patients as possible. And there was something called the COVID-19 digital staff passport, which was produced rapidly when the pandemic hit, and that was quite a basic form of a passport, basically saying that this person is a nurse and this person does work for X organisation, for example. So the new digital staff passport that we've developed is a lot more advanced than that. It's able to do a lot more and hold a lot more information, so staff can move around systems and move between organisations much more easily. If you could skip on to the next one, please. So what are the kind of key policy drivers that are forcing this? So there's lots of bits within, the NHS People Plan, the operational planning guidance, long-term workforce plan, and the NHS long-term plan. So in the long-term workforce plan, there's a commitment to say that we're going to have digital staff passports available to all staff by August 2025. We think that's something that's achievable. So it's something we're very much aiming for. If you skip on to the next one, please. So what is the challenge? So we know there's about 53,000 postgraduate doctors in training, and those guys frequently rotate between different organisations. So on average, they rotate organisations once a year and training roles every 6 months. And quite often when they do that, there's a lot of duplication. So if they're moving between an organisation, they have to turn up and prove who they say they are, because each organisation has to ensure that they are compliant with the same legal, regulatory and national policy frameworks that underpin them. So normally when somebody joins an organisation, a doctor in training will have to turn up on their first day of work with their passport to prove who they are, and also prove that they've got a right to work. And also there's, all the mandatory training that doctors have to do. And if they're rotating more frequently than once every year, for example, then quite often there's a lot of duplication. So if they've undertaken a piece of mandatory training 3 months ago, then if they move organisations, then the new organisation may make them take it again, so they can satisfy themselves that they are assuring they're compliant. So, the way we're trying to combat that is we're trying to offer a digital staff passport to all staff. And so, what is it? If we move on to the next one, it is a passport essentially which can hold your credentials. There's various credentials in there that can be held by an individual. So as part of discovery for this, we learned that individuals want more control over their own information. There is a big sense that NHS organisations have been able to share this information via ESR instance for a long time, and it's not happening. It's not happening properly. So people want to be able to have control of the information that they have, and they want to have control about how they send it to their organisations. So where are we in this journey at the moment? So the COVID-19 digital staff passport was released, so that's now in the process of being decommissioned. We are in the private beta phase at the moment, so it's that green dot. So we've been through alpha. We're now in private beta. We're just about to launch in November to our 4 pilot organisations, and then we'll get towards public beta, which is a larger rollout towards springtime in 2024. Once we've gone through public beta assessment, then it will be a national rollout and a national launch. If we move on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, so what is the digital staff passport? It's two main things essentially. There's a portal. And there's 2 portals within there. There's an employer's portal and an employee's portal. So employers will be able to import large numbers of records from their doctors in training rotations, and they'll be able to understand what credentials they do have for their doctors in training and their temporary staff movers, and which ones they don't. There'll be an employees portal, so they can log on to understand what they need to do and what they need to send. And then the employee will also have access to a digital wallet where they will hold their credentials. So they'll log on to their employees portal. They'll understand which credentials they need to send to their new employer. They can go and click on their credentials in their wallet and send them to their new employer. The digital wallet is a secure environment, so it's Microsoft authenticated digital wallet. So those credentials are secure, they can't be tampered with, and they are the property and under the ownership of the person that holds those credentials. And the staff member can control and choose which credentials that they want to share with their organisations. Employers can issue credentials. So if somebody undertakes a piece of mandatory training, for example, an employer can issue a credential to a staff member, and then, as I mentioned, the staff member can present their credentials to that organisation as well. If we move on to the next slide, please. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. So where are we? We are in the pilot private beta phase at the moment. So we're just about to go live. We've received our final minimum viable product from our supplier, and we're going through testing between now and the start of November, initially ourselves, and then with our pilot organisations to do the small scale rollout, and then increasing that at the early 2024, and then increasing that with wave 3 pilot systems later in springtime 2024. Move on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the initial use case around the digital staff passport was done around temporary movers and postgraduate doctors in training. Partly because these are the users that represented most frustration, or demonstrated most frustration with the moving process between organisation, the most amount of wasted time. But having said that, the digital staff passport can be used by anyone. So organisations can choose to use it for any of their employees. And if there are use cases within an ICS and they choose to use it, then that can be done. At the moment, it has been built around the use cases of temporary movers and doctors in training, but that doesn't mean it can't be used by others. In terms of number of users, so the small scale rollout, we think there's going to be up to 40 end users in that wave 1 pilot. And then that's going to scale up to approximately 1,600 end users for wave 2 private beta. And then that will ramp up quite significantly for wave 3 and wave 4 organizations. So by the time we enter wave 4, that's when we're preparing for the June and August rotations. We estimate there'll be approximately 5,000 end users, and that will allow us some really good testing, some really good feedback to be able to develop the product further and be able to pass the governmental GDS assessment rules about digital products, and then enter into public beta. On the last few slides, I've got some lists of the organisations that we're going to be that are currently part of waves 1, 2, 3, and 4. So wave 1 and 2 are pretty much set in stone at the moment. Wave 3 and 4, they are the organisations and systems that have expressed an interest and say that they are ready to be able to accept the digital staff passport. There are a number of things that organisations must do to be able to ensure that they are ready to be able to accept and use the digital staff passport. So they must have the relevant interfaces in place between their, if they've got third-party learning management systems, they must have the relevant interfaces in place between that and ESR. Their ESR data must be up to date, and it must have been cleansed appropriately for data to be able to flow through to digital staff passport. And the data in the LMS systems must have been cleansed and mapped appropriately for those interfaces to work between that and ESR. So there's a number of readiness criteria that organisations must meet before they are able to accept it. But if there are further organisations or systems that do want to be part of either waves 3 or 4, then we are saying please do get in touch with us and let us know, because there are if there are other organisations that want to be part of those waves that aren't currently, then we're keen to increase that list as much as we can. All right, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but any questions?
Any questions from anyone on the call for Marcus at the moment? Don't be shy.
I've done a few
Asha,
in the chat.
have we had one sent in again? There's a few not attended today, so we've had some questions sent in, which is positive in itself. Go on, Asha.
Yeah, so there is one other. What is in the plan for digital passporting to cover access to clinical systems that can vary from trust to trust? So medical equipment, for example, and provision of access to this? Yeah,
so this is something which is part of, so if there was on slide 5, there was a box just said the future. Mm-hmm. So the digital staff passport is going to be part of, has the potential to be something which is not only to something which holds your credentials, but it has the potential to be something which gives you access to different systems. At the moment, it is not that. So there are various projects going on, both across the NHS, but especially there's a piece of work called provisioning access to clinical systems within Blackpool and Lancashire South Cumbria that they are looking at to be able to, how do they get people that join the organisation access to the right areas and the right systems quickly, and how do you get that access provisioned and then deprovisioned when needed? So how do you know that when somebody moves from one area to another, they're not still able to access the previous area if they're not supposed to? So with the credentials in the wallet, that should in theory be able to link up with things like smart cards or something like that to be able to provide that access, but that capability isn't there at the moment.
That's really useful to know, though, Marcus, that it's in the planning. Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, and apologies if this just didn't go in, because there's a lot, obviously, to digital staff passports. But I'm wondering, is this going to be a mandatory requirement for every NHS member of staff, or is it something that they would opt into if they have an interest in working or moving around the system?
So there isn't a plan to mandate it at the moment. So it is something which our users are telling us that they want. Especially users that do move between NHS organisations regularly, they're telling us that they want, because they find it difficult and repetitive to be able to move between organisations. They won't have to do it, do things like training as much as they may have to at the moment. But not every staff member clearly will need something like the digital staff passport. If you have a member of staff which is in stable employment, saying it's been working on the same ward for 20 years and don't want to go and work in different NHS organisations, it's not going to be useful for them, and we wouldn't mandate it. So it will be useful for people if they are, and especially when you're kind of looking at this from an ICS level and the collaborative bank level, if you've got like the question that you posed earlier, Andrew, around, how do you prioritise things? Well, if you've got a digital staff passport and you've got all your credentials, if you haven't got the data sharing within the ICS already, or you want to share data between ICSs, then the digital staff passport could be part of allowing people to move, but it's not something which would be made mandatory.
I can see the benefit in that as well for an ICS system in terms of including feeding into sort of system redesign as well. You can actually move stuff around quickly according to prevailing demand. Things like national, major incidents, for example. It would be, or obviously part of the development of this was probably triggered by COVID, which was the precursor of COVID digital passport, as you said. Yeah, exactly.
And obviously at the moment the things that we can, the bits that we can get in there around identity. So we're working with Yoti and post office easy ID to be able to get identity verification. So that's identity credential. And then we're linked in with the training and information system, so the TIS systems and the core skills training framework. So you can have your mandatory training credentials within there as well. The things in the pipeline, so we've got linking in with occupational health, so you can have all your IMS and VACs and all of those kind of records and those kind of credentials as part of it. So and then there's also we've got agreement from the Home Office that on our plans for trying to get right to work as a credential within the digital staff passport as well. And then obviously once you kind of once you've got those, then you can start exploring the realms of skills. So you can have verified skills and experience credentials within there, and that would be really enabling when you are thinking about how to strategically place your workforce across a larger footprint. If you've got access to skills and experience, and that's verified and that's trusted and it's from the source information, then in theory it would allow you to plan your workforce in a much more optimized and streamlined way.
And it takes out so much duplication of workload, obviously, as well. But it seems also it has the potential actually to take cost out of other resource channels, even agency as well. If you're, potentially, if somebody has a substantive position within an NHS trust and they have a staff passport, actually, even where you are using agency, potentially it could cost less.
Yes. and linking in with things like collaborative banks, then it's exactly the same, isn't it? So
movement of those bank workers is critical, isn't it? Across. Go on, sorry, Andrew.
Yeah. So the other question was on.
We are running over slightly. I'll give you one more.
I won't keep you, but I love the tech side of it. So just the other thing was on where most trusts actually at the moment that have a bank use some kind of external software some sort of third-party bank management software platform. Where that's the case, and effectively that's operated by an external managed service partner, acting as the sort of border control for that trust, would those systems interface with what you described as the trust portal, so that if you see what I mean, so would external partners have access to the data within to be able to do the staff passport checks on behalf of the trusts, I guess is the question.
Good question. Not at the moment. So at the moment, it is when there is an NHS organisation and somebody is moving from one NHS organisation to another, either temporary or permanently, you're able to send those credentials between those two organisations. But in theory, it would either have to pass through or just go directly between those organisations for them to be able to for them to be able to kind of use that information to allow people to move around quickly and easily. So
it'd be a trust action within the process, at least, anyway. And then,
yeah.
It's just interesting as I'm thinking of how our solutions are kind of designed and fit for purpose for the future as to
and it's also just
like for that.
So it's also just one to remember. So the wallet is, and the credentials within it are the ownership of the person whose credentials they are.
Course,
so they choose who gets to see who they share it with and when they share it.
Of course, yeah. That makes sense. Right, I won't hog the time. This is another session of its own, isn't it, I think, as well. So
we keep finding more topics to discuss in a series of webinars, I think. But no, Marcus, that was incredibly insightful. Thank you so much. It's good to see the journey that's going to be taken for the passport. And I think we all probably agree on the call that it's going to be hugely beneficial for movement of bank workers and temporary workers. So thank you very much for your time. I know you have to leave us now. So if anybody does have any questions, I know you've said you're happy for us to forward them to you, and you can answer them after the event when they've absorbed the recording. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so we've had Marcus on now on the agenda. We are slightly behind, but as I say, we've got some flexibility today because we've just a few of us and lots of time ahead of us. So I'm going to move on to Helen, who's going to talk about bank procurement and supporting you with how to do that in the safest, risk-free way. Helen.
Thank you. And I'm quite happy, Andrew, that you made us go over there because you asked some of my questions as well. Okay.
Sorry, I just spoke on mute. Sorry, I laughed and said you're welcome.
Could you put my slides up, please?
Yeah, of course.
So I can remember.
Absolutely.
While we're getting there, so I'm Helen Hess. I'm one of the commercial agreement managers within the NHS Workforce Alliance, sitting in the CCS little bit of the Workforce Alliance, but essentially talking as Workforce Alliance here.
Sorry, Helen, get in there.
Okay.
There we are. You see that?
Lovely. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Can you pop onto the next one? So what I wanted to go through today, and apologies, I don't know what the mix of people is from a procurement, non-procurement kind of level of understanding. So apologies if I talk to procurement speak for anybody who isn't in the procurement world, or if I'm a little bit not so procurement speaky for anybody who is a procurement person. But what I wanted to go through today was a little bit about what a framework is and why use a framework agreement, a little bit about how to use a framework, some of the benefits, and then the kind of things that you could expect to support in the bank procurement piece. So if we move on to the next slide, for anybody who doesn't know who the Workforce Alliance is, we were set up around about 2019. We've been working together in various ways in the lead up to that, but became a formal partnership in 2019, and it's a partnership between Crown Commercial Service, which is a central government procurement organisation, and the NHS Procurement in Partnership group of collaborative procurement hubs who are embedded within the NHS. And we came about really because we've been doing very much the same kind of work with the same people for a number of years, and it made much more sense to be working together and pooling our resources and offering a much better to support to the NHS than we had been able to do. We're completely public sector organisation, be that NHS or central government, so we work kind of entirely in the interests of the NHS and other public sector organisations. Pop onto the next slide, please. So just some observations on the staff banks market landscape over recent years. Some of these numbers are probably a little bit out of date because things do move quite quickly. But I think particularly since the NHS England agency rules came into place and the focus became very much on increasing agency spend and moving over towards bank spend, we've seen a growing increase. I think that 115% is probably quite out of date now, but a significantly increase in use of bank staff, and that's certainly not expected to change at all given the direction of central policy. We've also seen quite a move away from traditional NHS staff banks, which would be very much focused on a bank of nurses, to now incorporating pretty much all staff groups, and with that a slightly changing model in how staff banks are set up and how they're run, because I think that it does work differently for the different staff groups based on, I think, how NHS trusts will use those staff, but also how those staff want to engage with a bank as well. And also the last point is really just sort of highlighting the benefits of the bank first approach that's becoming increasingly common. What's probably missing from this information is the rapidly increasing focus on collaborative banks across ICSs. Sometimes broader than ICSs, but certainly within ICS groups, it's becoming much more of a focus to be able to work collaboratively. Andrew, I think you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just testing my knowledge on that slightly. So my so that 115% increase in staff bank spend, and you've got there as well that there's that the average pay is 31% less through bank than agency, right? To my knowledge, that doesn't necessarily correlate to a reduction in agency spend, though. That actually seems to be going up as well. Am I right to assume that, or are there numbers I haven't seen?
No, I think you're probably right to assume. I'd say I think some of these numbers are a little bit out of date, and I think certainly over probably the last year or so, the agency there had initially, when the NHS caps came in, there was probably, in the short to medium term impact, there was a reduction in agency rates because of the focus on the caps, and particularly around the pay rate caps. And I think that to some extent was offset a little bit by increases in bank pay rates, because there was less spotlight on the bank pay rates. I think more recently those agency rates are heading back upwards again, mostly from a demand and supply point of view. Yeah. In certain staff groups more than others, but it certainly seems to be
demand and supply
pay rates. Yeah,
generally, isn't it? Through
yeah.
the actual the actual staff shortages that are driving the temporary demand, full stop. Yeah, that makes sense. But it's good to see. Obviously, it's less costly than agency, but as a sort of a metric for a specific trust would actually be to see the agency spend going down in relation to the bank spend as well. That's
and I think they need
interesting to look at numbers on that.
Yeah, and I think they also need looking at holistically, which is difficult to be able to see sort of sitting externally, because there's such a mixture of, certainly on the bank side and certainly as it's expanding into other staff groups, there's much more of the bank cost is actually just hidden in ordinary payroll cost, as opposed to it being a separated out bank payroll which with your traditional staff, any nursing staff banks, it's easier to see the whole as one sum.
Yes, as you say, there's a need for that holistic view of the data, I guess, for each trust or each system to actually be able to look at whether that is generating value and efficiency.
And I think it's very difficult to get that holistic view with any real degree of confidence.
Yeah, sure. Cool, that's helpful. I won't keep probing, sorry.
So just on a little bit around what a framework agreement is. Very, very basically, a framework agreement is an overarching agreement that has approved suppliers on the agreement working to established terms within established parameters for an established scope of services that can then be called off by specific customers that will enter into a dedicated contract at any point over the life of the agreement. And what it essentially gives, it essentially gives some controls to what can go in those call-off contracts when they're established. Just pop onto the next slide, because I'm going to go through some of those bits I've just touched on. I'll go through a little bit more. So try to pull out some of the benefits of using a framework agreement, and I'll touch on some of these as we go through. But from a sort of compliant procurement point of view, you can take some comfort in the fact that there has been a compliant procurement to put the framework agreement in place in the first place. In line with the NHS England agency rules, there is an accreditation process for framework agreements that are dealing with temporary workforce, and the framework agreements will have gone through an accreditation process to be able to be accessed by the NHS. The terms and conditions I'll touch on a little bit more detail in a minute. We've got an inbuilt health assurance function which is linked to the NHS England accreditation process. Linked with the compliant procurement process, the suppliers that are on there have gone through some element of pre-qualification to give assurances of their capability and their standing as suppliers, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that. And then framework agreements will generally come with some level of support to the call-off process from the framework agreement owner, and I'll talk through that a little bit more as well. We can pop on to the next slide. So looking specifically at the at staff bank frameworks, and I'm obviously going to be speaking from a Workforce Alliance perspective because that's the framework that I operate in and that I know pretty much inside out. It's set up using the public sector contract, which is a standard set of terms and conditions that's been explicitly designed for public sector users. So they're very much contracts, the contractual terms that are put in place to absolutely protect you as public sector buyers. The whole point is that they are flexible and that framework agreements are flexible, and that while there's a defined scope in there, and there are certain fixed terms and conditions, the scope and the associated terms and conditions can be tailored to meet whatever the specific requirements of the particular customer are, rather than necessarily needing to be a one-size-fits-all. And that really feeds through into the ability to tailor areas and to tailor areas across the terms and conditions, just to suit whatever internal requirements you have. What they also do, what is increasingly being called on, is put in place provisions to be able to contract as clusters of individual organisations, probably more generally at an ICS level, but to be able to all work to having the same contracts in place, be it a standalone contract or as one single contract across an ICS. Pop onto the next slide, please. Thanks. So the health assurance audit process, for many years now, we've had an assurance audit process applying to our temporary staffing framework agreements, and this has relatively recently been expanded to incorporate our bank contracts as well. And what that process looks to do is it looks to test suppliers who are supplying through the framework agreement against the NHS employers check standards, which are the compliance requirements that we have built into the contracts. It's part of the requirement for our NHS England approval. It's obviously one of the areas that NHS England are very rightly focused on, and it's undertaken on all suppliers who have spend through our framework agreements against the contractual requirements, and it looks at the policies and procedures that the suppliers have in place, and then it also measures the compliance of actual workers. Obviously, from a bank point of view, there are slightly different responsibilities within the worker compliance area, because there's a mix of different types of workers. So there are banks are very often made up of a large proportion of substantive trust workers that will then do their additional work through the bank. Some will be dedicated, some will be working collaboratively and have bank workers who perhaps work substantively in one trust within an ICS, but have some sort of collaborative arrangement where they can work flexibly in others. So we do make sure that it recognises where the responsibilities lie and doesn't put in any additional duplication, sort of going back to what Marcus has talked about around the passports, trying to make sure we can recognise that different arrangements will have different responsibilities in place, but testing where responsibilities fit with outsourced bank providers, that they are carrying out those obligations. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Just going back to some of the supplier qualification requirements, and they're generally around relatively high level corporate type requirements, but we at procurement stage and through the life of the framework will keep on track of the financial stability of the suppliers. This is, over the last few years, has become an increasing focus of all government contracts, and I think in a bank environment where really you're getting an outsourced supplier who is going to be quite embedded into the running of your organisation, it's obviously important to make sure that they're going to stick around and there's no risks of any financial failure. There are insurance and certification requirements built into the standard contracts that we will monitor and we will make sure are in place. There's been assessment of previous experience, and just going back to the point I made earlier about the kind of the flavour of banks changing as time goes on and as more worker types are being covered. That doesn't necessarily mean every supplier on a framework agreement will have experience of providing every type of bank, but it means they've got experience of providing the elements of the services that they're made up generally into delivering a bank. There is an increasing focus across the NHS on social value and carbon reduction public sector agenda priorities. Those are assessed at a framework level as well as being able to be assessed individually at a call-off level. And we've also got protections in place as well to focus on the government prompt payment schemes, and also any kind of, through the life of framework agreements, any government priorities and NHS priorities that come out are embedded into the framework agreements and the call-offs underneath those. Move on, please. So just looking at the different call-off options and the different ways to put into place a procurement. The framework agreements we have are generally fairly open to either running competitions to identify any outsourced suppliers or to make direct awards. The appropriateness of which route will be dependent on what it is that you're looking for, what's your starting point, and what kind of the market can offer. Generally speaking, for a bank, we would suggest that a competition is likely to be applicable because think it's fair to say that no two banks look the same, so it's very difficult to be able to clearly define a generic bank that you can say, yes, that's what I want, and go away and buy it. But it's very much down to the individual circumstances. The principles will stay the same whichever route you're looking down, and that's basically ensuring that you have identified in some fair way who is the best supplier to meet your needs. I'll touch on the next slide if you want to move on, just a bit more on that, about the kind of the mechanics of how to call off and how to put in place a contract. And again, I think these will apply whatever route you were looking to go down, be it through a framework agreement or anything sitting outside a framework agreement. And that's starting with knowing and being able to specify what it is that you're looking to contract for, which would form the basis of some form of engagement with the supplier base to identify capable suppliers. That's at the point I would probably suggest that you start looking at which is the most appropriate procurement route when you've identified what suppliers there are that are capable. Then using that procurement route to identify your supplier selection and pulling together the contract terms to enter into a formal contract. If there are any procurement people on the call, that is obviously very much a whistle-stop basic level how to do a procurement, but they're the kind of the key elements for looking at putting in place a contract. On to the next, which I think was the last area I was going to touch on, was some of the support that a framework operator like the Workforce Alliance would be able to provide. We, as framework operators, will be managing all suppliers on an ongoing basis. Some of the things that I talked about when just feeding back the market information at the start, we will be able to share market intelligence. We'll be able to share outputs from conversations we've been having with the supplier base, with policymakers, with other people who are running banks in various different guises. We can use all that sort of information to feed into business case support. So being able to give some benchmarking type information, outline costings, potential savings benefits that could be realised. We can support the process, the support available for the actual procurement process to varying degrees depending on what an individual or a group of trust would want, and then facilitate any resultant market engagement with the supplier base, and then we're also there as a kind of ongoing escalation point if there's any issues with any contracts that are in place throughout the life of those contracts. So again, a rather whistle-stop tour, and I think that was my final slide. I think my last, that was really it on my whistle-stop tour of bank procurement and use of framework.
Thank you, Helen. It was a whistle-stop tour, but actually, you know, if I was sat at my desk back in the day in the NHS and scratching my head on how to do procurement for setting up my bank, I think that would have been really useful, even though a whistle-stop tour. And I think, like you say, it's just important, isn't it, to link in with your procurement leads and people like yourself to just get that expertise and guide you through the process. And actually then from the workforce person's perspective, it becomes quite simple. Yeah, and I think that's sometimes because workforce is such a complex area, and it's an area that generally manages itself. I think that sometimes procurement people are a little bit scared of workforce as well. So I think there's possibly sometimes not so much engagement between the two areas as early on as perhaps there could be. I know that's a sweeping generalisation, but workforce people don't know procurement, and procurement people don't know workforce. So it's to your point, it's important to speak. Yeah, and the impact of, you know, getting something wrong with workforce, you know, it's all, you know, the accountability on everybody on the call is about, you know, we've got to staff effectively. So it's crucial actually that it's gotten right. So yeah, no, you're quite right. It's important to follow the framework, etc. Andrew, before I come to you, I'm just going to ask if there are any questions for Helen now, because I'm going to do Q&A now for Helen. If there aren't, I will come to you, Andrew. I'm just going to open up to the floor. If there is anybody on the call that wants to ask a question. If you don't feel as though you can ask it now, I'm more than happy for you to pop it in the chat. We'll come back to it later. And Helen, as have all the other presenters have said, they're more than happy to take some questions from us after today, and then we can get back to you. If you do go back to your desk and think, oh, I've thought of something, more than happy for you to send them in to us. That's not a problem. There aren't any hands, Andrew, so I will let you go. Go on.
It's a selfish question as well. It's just for me. But yeah, Helen, your sort of elevator intro there was it people procurement without the sales pitch? So for those of us with a sales pitch, to your point on supplier engagement, so I know that CCS promote the benefit of early market engagement. That's defined under Regulation 40 of the PCR 15, I believe as well. So is there more that your Workforce Alliance approved suppliers can do to proactively encourage that? And is it something actually that where there's reluctance to do that, perhaps from NHS trusts who feel that the advice they're going to get is going to be biased by the offering of the supplier?
Yeah, we will always encourage it, and increasingly so, I think, particularly, and not just in the bank space. I think generally in workforce space, there's so much that the market is doing differently, and so many ways in which markets are changing, that we will always recommend to any trusts that they shouldn't go in with a blinkered view about what it is that they need, but be open to learning what it is that they need. And that's, I mean, I would say, I know obviously there's an element of sales in there, but I would say that it's not even supplier specific. It's about what any supplier could do. A trust could speak to Retinue, get a great idea, and actually it's not something that it could develop into something that's not even something that Retinue does. But you've already you've opened the mind to what can be done, and just to try and make sure that people are thinking a little creatively about what could help their particular problems, rather than going in with we already know what it is we want, because it's what we've always had.
Because I think we help each other on that. It's good for us to listen to trusts in terms of what they know they need, or even just not what they know they need. They know they need. Sorry, it's not about defining the solution or products. It's about what you actually want it to deliver. Where do you want to get to? What's the vision? Yeah. So it's good for us really to hear that. But then, and you've been very good, I know, in setting up sessions and strictly telling suppliers, it's not a sales pitch. It's not about you, but define it from your perspective so that trusts can hear that and get food for thought, basically. And the more of that we do and share, I think the better, because we do sometimes see tenders go out for something that looks a bit dated to us, because we know we're doing better stuff than that now elsewhere. And it's we really want the chance to be able to, I'm sure other suppliers will as well, to actually just educate the buyers on something which they may well be implementing after thought that began a few years back, and actually it's accelerated through the innovation that ours as competing commercial organizations have actually evolved from. We're quite often a bit further down the road than what we're being asked to do.
Yeah, I think that there's some, there can sometimes be not necessarily a reluctance, but time restrictions can sometimes limit how much engagement and how much free thinking there is time to be done. I think the more everybody, and I mean that from a framework point of view, a supplier point of view, and a trust point of view, can experience the benefits and can share the benefits of engaging, and of sharing, going through that learning process, then the more scope there is for uptake of it.
Yeah,
that's good to hear.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Asha, I believe we have another question that's come in. Is that right?
Yep, right. So, Catherine, sorry, Helen, can you specify the length of contract we want a supplier using the frameworks?
As in, can the customer say how long they want the contract to be? Yes, there's no restrictions within the framework agreement on how long a contract can be. As long as it's under the PCR regulations, it has to be kind of within the norm of what the market would say. So it would be abnormal to go for, say, a 20-year contract, but within reason, there are no restrictions.
Lovely. Yeah. That was a nice, easy one. Thank you. Okay, have we any more questions? I'll just open it out one more time because we're just running over a little bit. Mind you, we're into the Q&A session anyway, so it's not too bad. Well, thank you very much, Helen. As I say, I think, you know, it's incredibly useful to hear that and just know, some of us to know that the framework is there and it's there to help, I suppose, really, because, as I say, from an NHS perspective, sometimes it can be quite, you know, daunting a task to undertake. So it's like you say, it's about that engagement early. And making sure that you can shape the solution that you need, isn't it? So thank you so much for your time. That's been incredibly useful. I believe one of my colleagues is going to now share the slide deck because I'm just going to walk through obviously my experience of being in the NHS and solutions that I've used. So can one of you share that and bring that up, please? Are we doing that? Because I can't see people.
I'll get that shared for you, Natalie. It won't be a second.
Thank you.
Because Terence is so dependable, I didn't even flinch. I just knew that he was going to share that.
And apologies for technical issues we're having today. I think we've got storms going over the country and internet dropping out here, there and everywhere. So it's a little bit hit and miss for us all. So we will get there though. I mean, I'll make a start. So my name's Natalie Hill, as I said at the top of the webinar. I'm head of Retinue Bank at the moment. I landed here in May following a long career in the NHS. So I've got over a decade of experience, everything workforce. So started out at trust level, migrated to work in ICB level, and then eventually at NHS England, actually working with Catherine on some things, who's on the call today. Yeah, lots of experience in project managing, rostering, temporary staffing, setting up banks from scratch. Set up a bank at one particular trust, starting off with nursing, and as Helen mentioned earlier, expanding that to all different staff groups, which is quite challenging in itself when there's a culture in an organisation where they're not used to that. It's predominantly nursing. Why would they want a bank? So did that and set that up from 0 to about 4,000 bank workers. So I suppose what I'm saying is I understand the challenges that are faced within the NHS and what needs to happen in terms of the hoops that need jumping through to get things signed off, to get policies written, to get things done, and again to procure suppliers to ensure we've got the right technology, the right support, the right management of banks moving forward. I'm really passionate about bank because often when I was in the NHS as well, I'd have the finance director knocking on my door saying, what are we spending on agency, what are we spending on bank this month? Okay, so if we're getting that much value from that many bank workers, why are we using all of that agency? So there was a constant drive, as you all know, to drive down that cost of agency and utilise bank more often. But also what I started to see towards the latter end of my time at the ICB in particular was this move to collaboration and this move to harmonise policies, harmonise rate cards, harmonise procedures, and actually look at how we could utilise staff across a region as opposed to just having that linear thinking and using staff within a trust. And what I did start to see when I spoke to the bank workers, because I was quite good at engaging them in several sessions and we had a lot of focus groups in the area that I was in, I started to see a desire from bank workers as well to actually want to work across a region because they wanted to develop skills, they wanted to try new areas of work, they wanted to work with different people and actually spread their wings and get some degree of professional growth as well. So it was a really exciting time and I thought, well, how can I be a part of that? So I started to to develop some things at a national level within the midwifery sector for workforce, and started to look about how you could grow your workforce, how you could grow banks. And then I thought, well, actually, what I really, really wanted when I was a workforce manager was the right solution and the right supplier actually to support me with that and to take me through that journey and actually take a lot of the headache away in terms of the management of it all, because as you know, we're all so busy, we're jumping from team meeting to team meeting to team meeting, we've got so much to do, and actually doing the staffing is only one part of the job in terms of a workforce manager. So it was important to ensure that I could leave that with a safe pair of hands, actually. So when I joined Retinue, I thought, you know, I need to understand how we can do that and how we can shape solutions for bank workers, for trusts to enable bank workers to work more effectively. Sorry, Terence, do we have the slides?
Good bit of freestyling, Natalie. It's brilliant.
Sorry,
That's an intro. It's my standard intro.
I'm sat here looking at the slides, so from my perspective.
That's all right. I'll go off me over the screen. Don't worry, I'll be absolutely fine. It's just to forgive me if I'm looking from side to side. So we will send the slides out everybody afterwards as well, so you'll have everything I'm talking about again to your delight. So what do we know now? We know that flexible working for permanent staff is very challenging to implement. We know, you know, we need to use more bank workers. We need to reduce agency. There is an over-reliance on agency to meet safe staffing. And we know to a degree, we've heard from some people, I've heard since I joined Retinue, that some NHS trusts have lost some grip and control since COVID. And it's important to get that back now, particularly with the long-term plan being published. Leaver rates are increasing as well because we've seen burnout from COVID, and agency spend is actually at unsustainable levels now. So we need to understand how we retain staff more. And part of that for me, what I'm passionate about is retaining the bank workers, because actually they are your permanent workforce of the future. So why bank and why now? As I've said, the long-term workforce plan was published. The focus, as we know, was on training, so significantly increasing education and training through apprenticeships, through alternative routes. My view is, why can that not apply to temporary workforce as well? Why can we not train bank workers to, you know, take on additional duties? I saw that happen in the bank that I managed, and it worked quite successfully. So healthcare assistants, for example, we trained them in additional tasks, so they were able to fulfill more of the nursing roles, and that alleviated some of the registered nurses to do more specific duties, which again made staffing safer. So training is one key aspect. Retaining, as I said, is critical, and it's in the long-term workforce plan. We need to keep more of the staff that we have. We need to boost flexibility. We need staff to work in ways that suit them, and we need to continue to improve the culture and the leadership that we have in each organisation. Thanks, Terence. I'll let you trip through those. The other part of the workforce plan is reform. So it's back to what Catherine talked about. It's about that productivity. It's about identifying the staffing gaps. It's making sure we're working and training in different ways. So utilise your rostering teams, get them to work with you to understand where those gaps are. Are they true workforce gaps that you're putting out to agency? Are you applying that 6 weeks in advance, 4 weeks bank release, 2-week agency release in the right way? Or should we be working more towards the 12 weeks in advance and being more proactive, like Catherine alluded to earlier? So for me, it's about creating new ways of educating you know, organisations and leaders, upskilling in new technology. So whether that's from a supplier, whether that's your rostering systems, whether that's upskilling people in understanding that interoperability doesn't just mean you have to have an API. Interoperability can work if you work with a supplier to do that for you. And it can be done in a safe and effective way to ensure you still have that visibility of your staffing from a temporary perspective, bank and agency. And it's about increasing that flexibility in deployment. So it's, as I say, it's about how can we grow the collaborative banks to then retain them, to then deploy them across a region and make sure we've got flexibility in using our workforce. Can we trip on a couple more, Terence, please? And then I think we're up to up to the point where I'm at. That would be great. So as I say, the growth of banks is crucial, and the retention of them even more. So Retinue have a bank solution. We have a really renowned bank solution that's been recognised as a market leader in terms of a managed service and a managed bank. We provide digital attraction and screening tools so we can grow your bank. We've got a skilled team, we've got expertise. I'm here now with the NHS experience, so I can talk to you at grassroots level and understand what you really need. It's again what Helen said, what is the solution you require? If we don't do it, we can help develop it. You know, we can work with you. It's having the right reporting that you need to report to board level. We've got all of the suite of Power BI to be able to do that. We've got visibility of shifts. We can make sure that it's, as I say, interoperable. So the technology has been built for the healthcare sector. We've been doing this for over 12 years now and work with lots of trusts. I used Retinue when I was in the NHS, and it worked incredibly well for me. We support a bank first approach, and that's so important. It's that 12 weeks or that 642 rostering rule. It's about pushing those shifts out to bank first, making sure banks and collaborative banks have got the opportunity to take up those shifts, to reduce those costs for you, and improve your fill rates actually. So if you grow your bank, you will improve your fill rates. Workers want choice and flexibility, so they don't want fixed shifts and they don't want committed hours. So we've seen that from permanent workers wanting more flexibility. I saw a lot of substantive permanent workers moving to bank only posts. I'd speak to them and say, you know, you do understand the implications of this, but the answer was, I want more flexibility. So retention is key here, and what we really want to be doing is going the other way and converting those bank workers to perm eventually. So at Retinue, we've got digital onboarding and attraction tools. We can grow your bank, we can drive engagement from bank workers. We've got app technology that can, absolutely make sure you're in touch with your bank workers, particularly on a collaborative level, because that's a risk, right? That's you know, if you're growing your bank, you might feel as though you're losing touch of those workers, but actually having the ability to engage with them on a daily basis with a communication tool at your fingertips is so important. And it's also important to the bank workers to be able to engage on that level with whichever organisation they want to work with at a collaborative ICS or ICB level. Next slide, please, Terence. And I won't rattle on anymore. So that's a little bit about our comms and engagement platform. We've got, as you see there already, I've said it's renowned, we're using it, it's a market leader. We've got 250,000 healthcare workers using it already. It's unique in the sense that it's not a WhatsApp, it's not, you know, unsafe, it's not a risk to your organisation. You can register an individual bank on there, it's digital onboarding, and we've got the comms and engagement piece that is most crucial. So as I say, when you're looking at a bank and looking at growing a bank, you want that 360 feedback from your bank as well. Well, we've got survey tools on there, we've got a news feed, we've got organisation announcements that you can put on there at a collaborative bank level and not just at individual level. So it's a best in class candidate app. I've seen hundreds of apps out there, and this is the one that works the best. Next slide, please, Terence. So what are the cultural benefits of a bank and collaborative bank? So I think I've touched on some of this already. It's reducing that agency spend. It's improving that workforce productivity. Again, you know, everybody's talked about that today at length. Colleagues work better with those they're familiar with. You know, if they get familiar with working on a particular ward with a particular ward manager. That ward manager values their loyalty in booking those shifts all of the time, and that happens through bank. What I often did is have some conversations, particularly through COVID, and they'd say, I don't know who's turning up from one minute to the next. It's great having the long-term agency workers, and they, you know, they do value their support, but actually bank workers feel more part of the organisation. What you do see as well with collaborative banking particularly, sickness levels and absence will be reduced. Bank workers are more likely to turn up for a fill a shift if they feel connected. So they'll feel connected to a trust, they'll feel connected to a region. As I say, they'll probably end up working more or less full-time hours, even though they've said initially they want that flexibility, if they're valued and if they're invested in. I think that's the key, investing in them as a worker, and not just seen as that temporary stopgap to fill your shift. There's improved quality of customer and patient care, that goes without saying. If they've got continuity of care, that was a big issue, you know, throughout COVID particularly. What we now need to start to do is grow that bank workforce and get that continuity of care aspect improved, and again in turn you'll start to see clinical improvements such as reduced mortality rates as a result, improved discharge rates, which is super important with bed space in hospitals nowadays, reduced risk through improved procedural and compliance. So bank workers are going to be more familiar with organisational systems and protocols. And if we look at what Marcus was saying earlier around the digital passport and access to systems, once that comes in, my goodness, collaborative banks will just take off. We will have workers that will be able to, you know, passport across a region, access all the systems, access all of the wards, you know, at the drop of a hat with that tool. And with the deployment tools that we can provide as a supplier to get them in that place, then, you know, it's a winner every day of the week. There'll be fewer roster gaps. I've talked about continuity of care for patients. And, you know, what we all forget is that mental well-being for workers as well. So if they're welcomed onto a ward, if they're a regular worker, if they're invested in, they'll develop professional growth, they'll have diverse skills and expertise, working at one hospital one week, another hospital another week. It might be a different speciality, they might specialise in medicine, then they might want to move into surgery. So it's important, you know, that we've got that opportunity for bank workers as well as permanent workers. And not forgetting, you know, the back office staff, you know, because I've said the focus sometimes has to be on nursing, and it does for safe staffing for acute trust, but actually, you know, the back office workers can be, you know, supported by bank too. You know, we do have sickness there. We do have obviously all the usual workforce issues. So it's about growing admin banks. It's about growing estates and facilities banks. It's about supporting that engine room of a hospital or of an ICB. And that, as I say, improved mental well-being will be a result of growing the workforce. Above all, you know, we've seen leaver rates in some regions and turnover rates increase up to 20% in some regions in the UK, which is just a phenomenal rise. So what we now start to see with growing the bank and having people in situ working those regular shifts is retention rates, you know, reducing and staff turnover reducing as a result as well. So the cultural benefits are just immense. You know, if we get the engagement right, we get the comms right, we grow the bank, we have the right technology and the right services to support, or a supplier to support that bank across a region, then trusts will benefit immensely. Next slide, please. That might be me done, Terence. There we go. So does anybody have any questions at this point? We've had questions pop up all the way throughout the session, so I'm not too concerned. We've run over into 15 minutes into question and answers. I know we've been quite a unique group today, but it's nice to see you all on the call, so thank you for joining us. I hope you've been able to take something away from today, and as I say, we will share the webinar slides, we will share the recording of the webinar, and please, you know, feel free to cascade that, share with colleagues, and come back to us with any questions that you do have. We will hope to do a series of webinars. So if you've got any suggestions about what you'd like to see from us at Retinue, and certainly, you know, if there's anybody at NHS England that you'd like to feature on these and support us, we are working in partnership because, as you can see from this webinar today, we've all got the same vision. It's about supporting the NHS moving forward and making sure we've got the right solutions to do that. So thank you from me.
Yeah, thank you to all of our presenters and everyone who attended as well, and my colleagues, of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. That's really nice to hear. First time you've attended. So do share it with colleagues, as I say, and if you've got any questions, come back to us. But yes, Marcus has left us, but thank you again, Catherine and Helen. Incredibly interesting presentations from you both, and I think tied in really nicely with our topic today. So thank you so much.